No one could more perfectly explain the unique situation of the African American women in this country's history than Deborah Gray White of Aren't I a Woman? The African American women, she said, are confronted with an impossible task. If she is rescued from the myth of the Negro, the myth of the woman traps her. If she escapes the myth of the woman, the myth of the Negro still ensnares her. While Deborah Gray White addresses the myths surrounding African American women in the antebellum South that were created by white men to control and sexually abuse African American women, we would like to address the progress that has been made for African American women in society, as well as the way those stereotypes have been perpetuated in the media in the years to come. While Black women have always played an extraordinary role in the struggle for freedom and equality, the explosion of media in the late 1950s to the present day was able to document those changes. Through music, television, radio, magazines, and movies, African American women have been able to shine, but there have also been instances in which those forms of media have taken cues from history and spread images that continue a cycle of oppression. The 1950s was an important time in American history, and especially African American history. The world watched as Rosa Parks stood up for her rights in Montgomery, Alabama, though took little note of the strength of Claudette Colvin in the same city. The 50s was a time to fight for change, but Americans could turn on their TVs or go see a movie in which African American women were still portrayed as the myth of the mammy, which had been around since the days of slavery. Actress Ethel Waters portrayed the mammy character on both TV and the silver screen, while people turned into their radio and listened to Chatty Hattie Leaper, the first African American female radio personality. It's interesting to see the juxtaposition of the growth being made, but also to note that century-old stereotypes remain extremely prevalent. The civil rights movement worked tirelessly against these stereotypes to create a new America in which all people could enjoy the same liberties. While brave college students, Black and white, men and women, were making a name for themselves in the movement of the era during sit-ins and protests, African American women were making progress in the media. Good Times showed the first African American family on television, and Esther Rolle played a loving mother who worked to support her family. While this show was in one light a win for the African American community, it also duly worked to present a negative portrayal of Black people living in poverty. During the same decade, Katiti Kurande was the first African American woman to grace the cover of Glamour magazine in 1968, and Diahann Carroll demanded to have roles on the silver screen, equal to alongside white actors. During the 1960s, the NAACP worked to obliterate the Jim Crow America that was created post-Civil War and had unprecedented victories in the U.S. court system. The civil rights movement of the 1960s provided more positive change and racial acceptance for African Americans, especially in the next decade to come, the 1970s. Vogue magazine followed Glamour magazine's example. In 1974, a young Beverly Johnson became the first African American woman to have her face on the cover. Vogue had been exclusively covered by white women in the past, so this was an important moment for African American women and represented a new era. African American women were finally getting recognition from a white society that had always worked to demean and stereotype them in all aspects, especially media. One should not be fooled into believing that the negative images of African American women in the media had disappeared entirely after the advancements made in the civil rights era and the empowering decade of the 1970s. In the 1980s, one could still say that the image of the African American woman was still being sexualized with the character that Jackie played in the hit television series 227 as a Jezebel figure. Her character Sandra never ceased to make an audience laugh, but at the same token, she adorned tight clothing, displayed vanity, and was often looked at as a sexual object. This is not much different than the typical myth of the Jezebel that white men used to objectify Black women since the birth of this nation. Even in Michael Jackson's Thriller video, one of the most widely recognized music videos of all time, Ola Ray plays the role of the terrified woman who needed the comfort of a man in a horrific situation. Ray, a Playboy bunny, supported the idea that African American women were counterparts to men and couldn't hold their own or take care of themselves. It is extraordinarily frustrating to see the negative myths that were around in the 1880s were still alive in the 1980s, nor were they going anywhere during the 1990s. We continuously saw women sexualized in music video, but it should be clarified that video vixens were not the creation of 20th century music industry. Long before, in the early 1880s, Sarah Bartman, a young African woman, was sold as a circus act for the entertainment of white people. She was forced to dance at shows and exhibitions before a racist white audience and was touched, prodded, and laughed at. She spent years in Paris and London, but when her audience grew tired of her, she was forced into prostitution. Her audience used her and laughed at her expense while she was suffering, thousands of miles from home with no family to comfort her. She died at only 25 years old of syphilis, and her story is a tragedy. Though the video vixens of the 1990s didn't necessarily perform for the same audience, they were still objectified and valued more for their bodies than their minds. During the same decade, we saw magazines make progress with their inclusivity of different races on magazines. However, it is important to note that many of the African American women who covered mainstream magazines were of fairer skin, and it is a rarity to see women of darker complexion on printed media and TV. Moving on to the 2000s, we continue to see magazines and television lighten women of darker complexion and whitewash women who were already very fair-skinned. The use of Photoshop has created several controversies, and many argue that the skin lightening of women in the media is an attempt to appeal to a white audience. It is disheartening to see the progress that has been made over numerous decades regularly gets overshadowed by the efforts to appeal to a white audience. Why and who creates the images that lighten African American women or women of a darker complexion? Are those images approved by the women who are being photographed, or are they being marketed by people in positions of power? The same questions could be asked about women on shows like Basketball Wives. Some say they represent the image of a modern Jezebel character. These women on reality TV are often portrayed as gold diggers and overly sexual. As far as their appearances, they are often curvy and lighter skinned with straight hair and are often commented on their exotic looks. But who is their audience? What message do they want to send? And are they merely trying to sell themselves to an audience the same way Sarah Baartman was sold as a circus act? Or are they being directed to look and behave a certain way? Regardless, they perpetuate the very road that Deborah Gray White tries to demit throughout her novel, and this might make one wonder how far we really have come. Deborah Gray White's final paragraph of Aren't I a Woman beautifully characterized the strength of African American women throughout history. In Slavery and Freedom, we practice an alternative style of womanhood, a womanhood that celebrated heroism but accepted frailty. A womanhood that could answer a confident and assertive yes to the persistent question, aren't I a woman? We agree that African American women are beautiful and strong, and they have defied the constraints that others have inflicted on them due to their race and their gender, time and time again. This is undisputable. However, we would like to ask, as critical consumers of media, how is it possible that we are still seeing African American women presented as the same stereotypes that are centuries old? And finally, how do we stop the cycle of oppression that the media has always perpetuated and continues to perpetuate? Be an active consumer of media and don't just see, look, and refuse to be an active participant in this damaging cycle. It is up to you to open your eyes and the eyes of others.